Okay. Um, Thank you all. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm presenting a paper that I'm working. Oh, what did I just do? Okay. Sorry about that. Um, so I'm presenting a paper that is part of a broader project that is being funded by the Bosch Foundation on digital wallets and migration. That project is being headed up by Emrys Shoemaker, who is here in the audience as well. And as part of that project, I've been working with a PhD student named Isadora, who's based in Edinburgh, who unfortunately could not be here today, but I'm presenting the paper sort of on both of our behalves. She is a primary author on the paper, and she's been working with us to a certain extent on this project. I should note that she is really the expert on the EU and on digital infrastructures in the EU, which is what this paper is about. So she is actually writing a PhD on the EU digital identity wallet, and one of only a handful, I only know of two PhD students in total who are currently writing about the EU digital wallet. So I recommend checking out her work. Her dissertation, I think, will be out soon. I also, my caveat being that most of my research is in Kenya. I'm not an expert on EU digital infrastructures or EU law. So please don't ask me questions about the minutiae of EU law. I might not be able to answer, but I can certainly direct those questions to her. But what this paper is essentially about is comparing two digital ID infrastructures in the EU that are very rarely talked about together and very rarely brought into a common framework. That is the EU digital wallet and a system known as Eurodac. We're still sort of developing this paper, so I very much welcome feedback, but our belief is by comparing and juxtaposing these two systems that, again, aren't typically talked about together, that can offer a number of very novel insights. So the two systems, again, that we're talking about, one is the EU digital wallet, which is a system that is very much in flux because it is literally being rolled out as we speak. The legislation, the regulations governing the EU digital wallet were just recently passed, and currently the wallets are now in pilot phase. There's about 4 different consortia in the EU that are developing EU digital wallet pilots. We can think about the EU digital wallet as being part and parcel of a broader kind of wallet turn within the digital identity space, most notably the Apple and Google wallets. And so in some ways, this is the EU's response to the Google and Apple wallets in developing their own wallet. The wallet, the sort of ethos behind the EU digital wallet is very much this idea of empowerment and control of data, as well as the idea of EU market integration. And again, it's still in its sort of early days. So what the EU digital wallet will become, what it will look like in practice, and there will actually be more than one wallet because each member state will be developing its own. What it will ultimately look like is a bit up in the air at the moment, but that also makes it, I think, an interesting moment to study. We are comparing the EU digital wallet to Eurodac. Eurodac is, unlike the wallet, a fairly old system. So it was developed first in 2003. However, it's also an interesting moment to study because it's undergoing very dramatic changes as well. As part of the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, there have been 5 core pieces of legislation that have recently been passed that have very dramatically, or at least will very dramatically change the way that asylum processes will operate in Europe. And as part of one of the core pieces of legislation has been a revamping of the Eurodac system. So in its initial iteration, this was actually a fairly stripped down version of a biometric database that functioned on a hit no-hit basis. And the main purpose of Eurodac, at least historically, again, this is changing, has been to enforce the Dublin regulation, which is really a set of regulations about which EU member state will be responsible for processing an asylum claim. And that typically tends to be the first country in which an asylum seeker arrives. So Eurodac was historically meant to enforce that system by essentially checking an asylum seeker's fingerprints against the existing database to see whether they had made a claim for asylum in another EU member state country. However, under this new pact, this system again is changing. There's been going to be a massive expansion in its scope, in its purpose, in the amount of data that's collected, and I'll talk about that in more detail. And unlike the EU digital wallet, is governed, obviously designed for a very different set of people, but also governed by a very different ethos. It's very much about the centralized administrative control of data, and it is very much premised on compulsion. And unlike the EU digital wallet, which is premised really on being a voluntary service provided to citizens. So the guiding questions behind our paper, which again, we're still sort of working on and developing, are the following. What accounts for the emergence of these different digital identity systems, from consumer and citizen-centric digital wallets to centralized non-voluntary biometric databases? And what explains the differential applications of centralized biometric systems and purportedly more privacy-preserving digital wallets, the latter being primarily aimed at EU citizens? Now, I should note that in a number of Commonwealth countries, and the UK in particular, there is very clearly a sort of divide in terms of how biometrics are applied. There has been a real resistance on the part of citizens to using biometric digital ID systems. And I think this was most evident in the UK during the Blair years, where there was a failed attempt to introduce a biometric ID. That is not necessarily the case in the EU. There's a number of EU countries that have longstanding ID systems that collect and use biometrics. That resistance is not necessarily there. However, those systems tend to have a number of safeguards in place. They have a number of purpose limitations and constraints. The kind of system that Eurodac is quite distinct, as I think will become evident, and one in which I think it's fair to say EU citizens would not typically consent to. Okay, so I thought the best way to present Isadora and my findings and ideas was in the form of a chart. So I wanted to go through a number of characteristics that I think you can see in both systems that illustrate some of the differences that we're trying to pull out. So in terms of stage of implementation, in the case of the EU digital identity wallet, as I mentioned, it's still in the pilot phase, but the EIDAS-2 legislation has been passed. Eurodac, again, well established. As of 2019, it had almost 6 million people's fingerprints in its database, but this actually is likely to expand. Originally, Eurodac was intended to collect the fingerprints of asylum seekers and some irregular migrants, but that now it will soon have a much broader array of data from a wider array of people who might be deemed irregular migrants. In terms of users, so the EU digital wallet is primarily intended for citizens, although what we're seeing so far is that regularized residents may also be able to access it, as well as businesses, but there's a big open question as to whether non-regularized residents or third country nationals and non-citizens will really be able to actually access the wallets. It's not necessarily really designed with them in mind. In the case of Eurodac, again, initially designed for asylum seekers and refugees and some categories of irregular migrants, but under the new regulations, it will include a much broader array of irregular migrants, and quite controversially, children as young as 6. Previously, it was as young as 14. So they're lowering the age at which data, including biometric data, will be collected. In terms of the kind of overall technology and design, the EU Digital ID Wallet is meant to be a decentralized smartphone-based digital wallet. Although, as Isadora could explain if she were here, its implementation is quite dependent on the choices of EU member states. So they could potentially also opt for other solutions that still guarantee things like unobservability. So again, we'll have to see how these things play out. Whereas in the case of Eurodac, we're talking about a very centralized biometric system. In terms of the ethos, rationale, and purpose of these two systems, again, we see a big contrast between the two. So the wallet is really intended to make it easier for EU citizens and residents to identify themselves across the EU, the EU in general. For both public and private sector purposes, it's meant to further integrate the EU internal market. It is very much framed around putting individuals in control of their data. Whether it will do that or not is maybe another question. And two, very explicitly, it's aimed at providing an alternative to commercial wallets. And a lot of observers have argued that this is very much designed as a result of pressure from big tech. And we can also see it as part and parcel of a larger EU digital sovereignty objective. Eurodac, again, initially used to enforce the Dublin regulation to prevent quote-unquote asylum shopping and to facilitate the monitoring and detention of irregular migrants. But what we're seeing now is a real shift towards the use of Eurodac for law enforcement and border enforcement. So police were first allowed access to the database in 2013, which they previously didn't have access to. And under these new regulations, the new regulations will facilitate Eurodac's connection to EU migration and police databases as part of a much broader interoperability push that has been ongoing for a number of years. Under the new regulations, the list of Eurodac purposes will also expand to include things like general support for the asylum system, assistance with applying resettlement regulation, control of irregular migration, the detection of secondary movement, child protection, the broader identification of purposes, supporting the EU's travel authorization system and visa information system, as well as the production of broad migration statistics. So again, a real expansion in its scope and its use and its purpose, whereas the initial version of Eurodac had quite a few constraints on what could be collected and what its intended use was for. And what a lot of critics and observers have argued that there's a tendency under these new regulations to strengthen the application of negative mutual recognition without strengthening positive mutual recognition. So meaning essentially that increasingly the purpose will be for EU member states to be informed if someone had their asylum application rejected in another country, but it's not necessarily intended to encourage those who are either in process or who have had their asylum application accepted, to enable them to move freely across the EU. In terms of the data collected, so the EU digital wallet is really meant to store various kinds of credentials. Again, what exactly it will store depends on the outcome of these pilots. Currently, the large-scale pilots focus on things like identification documents, so driving licenses, passports, education credentials, health cards, prescriptions, travel-related documents is definitely a purpose that seems to be quite key for a number of these pilots. And it also seems like the wallet will have some kind of a payment function and will be able to be used to register a SIM card. In terms of Eurodac, again, initially, the initial version of it actually stored a very limited set of data. It was, I think, what you could argue as being semi-anonymized. So it only stored things like fingerprints, gender, date of registration, and member state of origin. It really was just intended to determine whether this person, whether their fingerprints had been captured previously. And in fact, for that very reason, if you read there's a lot of really good ethnographies of how Eurodac has been used. And it was definitely the case that a number of European countries, so-called frontline countries, it was the case that police and immigration officials would sometimes resist fingerprinting people to, in essence, enable them to travel further north and have their asylum applications considered elsewhere. And this, as you might imagine, caused quite a bit of tension within the EU. But under the new regulations, there's a much wider array of data that will be collected, including from children as young as 6. And there will be an expansion in the types of biometric data, including facial images. And the data that will be collected will include things such as name. Previously, that the name wasn't included. Nationality, place, date of birth, travel and ID document, as well as from those who are resettled, relocated, disembarked following search and rescue, arrested at borders. So a much wider array of people as well. I'm going to finish up very briefly. There's also very different data protection provisions in place in these two systems. So the EU Digital ID wallet is being designed to be compliant with GDPR, at least in theory. Eurodac, what we're increasingly seeing is that the purpose limitations that were in place are being eroded, and there'll be much greater data retention periods in many cases. Conditions for law enforcement consultation will be much less stringent, and it will be used for surveillance purposes in a much more obvious, explicit way. To conclude, in comparing these two systems, what we want to argue and what we want to put across is that comparing these two systems uncovers differential identification regimes in the EU. And here we're drawing on the work of Lydia Morris, who refers to this concept of civic stratification, the systems of stratified rights for migrants and citizens across different EU member states. We also are arguing that comparing these two systems reveals tensions at the heart of the European project, which seeks to facilitate greater mobility for European nationals on one hand, while also constraining the mobility of third country nationals on the other. And we also see a tension between this ethos of market integration and policy cooperation, which sits in tensions with very real disagreements between European countries over this question of refugee, quote unquote, burden sharing. And then finally, we are arguing that this points to an emerging regime where differential political membership for both citizens and non-citizens is reflected in and reconstructed through the architecture of different identification infrastructures. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments.